Prototyping chatbots is not trivial because once we start even just inputting text in little speech bubbles, as you can see here in the example from Wall Street Journal, this American bank, Capital One, had to hire a character expert from Pixar to make sure that when returning the conversational things here, that the little speech bubbles have a personality, that they treat the user in a way where the user finds it fun. And this means that when it comes to Internet of Things, you have all sorts of problems popping up actually, because you will have to bridge what is essentially physical things like light bulbs, like cars, like maybe the auditory interface, with some digital domains, which could be like Spotify, or it could be like how do you save data on Google Drive. And this means that you come up with, first of all, a little more complex system design, where you have to think of the design as really a behavior. How do these sequences of triggers and actions link up, and what do you want to achieve with them? Because this is the overriding thing. What is the goal? So a simple way of prototyping it is that you could use IFTTT if supported by the BMW or the light bulb or the Oticon thing. Then they could just say, okay, if the user does something, which is defined by the if, then we have these actions, which will bring us one step further down the chain in terms of the sequences. What are the interactions? But when it comes to the voice, this little guy here has all ears, I can see, or just inputting text similar to voice, like what you would do in chat, it's really something where you could say there is a conversational interface here as an interaction model, and you gradually figure out what is the meaning of this dialogue. And that's done based on what do you say, these are the utterances, and how do they map to what you want, these are the intents. And, when you think about bots, you can think of them as either being very straightforward and doing that, so you achieve this. But you could also think that maybe if it's something more like Alexa, where you have a speaker and you want it to be fun and stuff, then you would put more emphasis on actually talking to people. And in this case, I think something like API AI as a tool is nice, because it applies machine learning for training. The first part of the thing, which is what are these entities? And this is what is highlighted here on the page in terms of red, yellow, green words, which is that it already has some assumptions on what entities are you going to present, and it understands something about time and geography. So for example, in this example here, where if you can make a little weather bot, you can say, what is the weather going to be like? And so it knows that the intent is weather, and it knows that the little orange ones here are has to do with time, and the yellow ones with where are we, in this case in San Francisco. So if you look at the upper right corner, you can see I'm trying out then to say, okay, how is the weather in Denver? And it will make a assumption that, okay, Denver must be a town. So we treat it like San Francisco, and then we fall back on the other things, like when do we want to hear this? What is the weather forecast for in terms of time? But you could also look at it and say, maybe it's more like the intents, and flow, I think, is much more about the intents as a prototyping tool than API. And say you can just sort of easily integrate with lots of existing services, and you can imagine these sequences then being triggered. So it has like two things, flows and bots. Bots means how am I linking up my logic with something where people can talk to it or input things. In this case, Facebook Messenger is a bot. So this means you create flows in Flow, and they are linked to a bot. It could be Slack, but this one here is actually a Facebook Messenger bot. Then, when somebody talks to your Facebook bot, it will be forwarded to your flow. So the flows are like little micro interactions. You have all sorts of little things happening, triggering one another, and it trickles down like this. So in this case here, you can see you can ask some specific things, and I made some shortcuts, which means that little speech bubbles will pop up underneath, so you don't encourage people to misspell the thing. So the bot will go, I don't understand what you're saying, but you rather press, okay, I can see I have 4 choices. These 4 choices will boil down to some contrasts, which you have in the next flow. So triggered by those, you can then say, okay, do I want this? Do I want that? And here it's done in JavaScript code, but you could also hardwire it, simply drag and drop if you wanted to do this, but this is to make it a little more generic. And then we get to the point where, based on your input, so in all these flows you have lots of sort of back and forth, and you made some input here, and that triggers that the bot will then have to make a decision. You said so and so, and I will assign a value to this. In this case here, it's fairly simple. There's a +1 or -1 value based on the response you gave to the question from the bot. And this then means now we get into the real action. This is then, okay, the bot asked, and your utterances were mapped to intents, and now it want to actually do something with what you have. So here we have a kind of big flow of little triggers, actions, which are, how am I gonna interact with the outside world? So this is the Internet of Things thing, because this is just a hosted service on a server, right? And it needs to talk to, in this case, an auditory interface from Otigan. So what you will see it doing is that you will have, among the many things in the flow, if this and that, you go down, then there is a webhook thing. So that means it will say, okay, I will create an HTTP request at some point. And the other thing is I will save the data on what I just did. And I will have to figure out again, after doing this, is the user satisfied with that? And I will save the data again in Google Drive. So here you see the HTTP request. It's fairly simple because it picks up all these parameters from the previous dialogues and saying, okay, based on what was asked and what was answered, the outcome was such and such. And this is then generating a webhook request, which means that you don't need to set up a server or anything like this in terms of prototype. You just do this through IFTTT. You have an IFTTT account yourself, which means that it understands that the webhook relates to you, and in this case it will then say, okay, then your device should have these settings updated. Similarly with prototyping the memory stuff, that whenever we go in and add a row, people say something, then we do something, then people have a chance again to say, is this okay, or do I want to revert? Creates this flow here in Google Drive very, very simply. But it's not simple what you see here, because if you look at the pie chart to the right, you can actually see what type of intents trigger what types of actions. So what we have is like an abstraction on top of what people do. We ask them through the bot, is that because you want it more bright, or is it because you want to reduce the sound here, or is it that the noise is bothering you? All these things we can map out and see in time what is it that actually makes somebody want these things, and we can in turn analyze this and make them into user preferences.